He left everything to my daughter-in-law the moment I buried him and said I should feel grateful because she would carry on his name. I smiled, while something inside me broke, quietly. That baby was never my son's, and I think my husband knew it. So why did he reward her instead of protecting me? The first time I realized something had shifted, it was over seating arrangements, a small thing on the surface. But in grief, you start to notice what people do when they think you no longer matter. We were holding a memorial dinner for Alan, my husband of 43 years. Bryce and Jocelyn, my son and daughter-in-law, had offered to organize it. I didn't argue. I thought maybe that was their way of showing respect. I was wrong. When I arrived at the house, it was already full. Neighbours, distant cousins, former colleagues of Alan are barely recognized. Jocelyn walked across the room like a hostess, all confident smiles, thanking people for coming. She wore a sleek black dress, tailored within an inch of her life, and a pin that had once belonged to me. One I hadn't seen since Alan's last birthday. I stood by the entrance for several minutes. No one greeted me. No one said my name. When I asked Jocelyn where I should sit, she gestured vaguely toward the back patio. "You're with the ladies from the gardening club," she said, already turning away to refill someone's wine. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't the wife anymore. I was just another elderly woman with a handbag and a cardigan someone people passed their plates over. I sat at the far end of the table under the citronella lamp with 3 women I hadn't seen in 5 years. We made polite small talk, but my ears kept tuning in to Jocelyn's voice, echoing from the living room. She was talking about Alan's investment properties, laughing about how he used to call them his little legacies. She sounded proud, like they were hers now. And then I heard Bryce laughing along, talking about plans, renovating the lake house, maybe selling the main cabin. I kept my face still. I didn't say a word, but something started to press at my chest. Later that night, I walked back into my car and sat in silence for 10 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just stared ahead at the dashboard light. Something had shifted, something big, and I knew deep down I would not be able to ignore it for long. It's funny how a person can live in a house for decades and not realize she's been slowly pushed out, quietly, bit by bit, until one day you're eating potato salad with near strangers while someone else tells your husband's story like it belongs to them. I wish I could say I stood up and made a speech, or that I demanded respect. But I didn't. Not that night. That night, I took it all in, and I made a silent promise to myself. I was going to find out exactly what Jocelyn had planned, and this time I wouldn't look away. A week after the memorial, I was called into the lawyer's office. Samin Carr had handled Alan's business affairs for years, and I trusted her. She didn't smile when I walked in, just nodded and gestured for me to sit. The room was cool and quiet, full of old leather and dark wood. It smelled like paper and varnish. Samin had a manila folder in front of her. She opened it slowly as if she knew the weight of what was inside. She started reading Alan's will. I waited, hands folded, spine straight. I had heard it all before in my head. The house would come to me. The investments would go to Bryce, maybe shared with the grandchild on the way. Alan had always believed in generational legacy. He used to say I'd earned my rest, that I deserved a soft landing. I took that to heart. It had never crossed my mind to doubt it. Samin's voice was steady. She read the terms like it was any other document, but the words came down like stones. Alan had left the house to Jocelyn. Not just the house. The Redmond family home. The summer cabin in Maine. The small investment properties scattered across Vermont. All of it. To Jocelyn. She was named as the sole steward of the estate. The condition was simple. The estate would remain in her name until Bryce had a son bearing the traits of the Redmond line. Those were Alan's words. My name appeared once, on a parcel of land that Alan and I had argued over 20 years ago, a rocky, unused corner plot near a marsh, a place we never developed. He left that to me, and nothing else. Samin paused after reading. She waited for me to say something. I didn't. I kept my hands, folded, my lips pressed together. I was not going to fall apart in front of a desk. She handed me a copy of the document gently, said I could review it at home. I nodded, thanked her, walked out into the parking lot with the envelope pressed to my chest like it might shatter if I loosened my grip. Inside the car, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. Alan had written this. He had signed it. He had looked at those words and decided they were fair. And it hit me like a second death. Not just losing him, but losing the belief that I had been seen by him, known by him, loved fully. What kind of man leaves his wife of 4 decades a patch of dirt and gives everything else to the woman who barely married into the family? What kind of husband makes his wife feel like a tenant in her own life? Back home, I sat in the kitchen for hours. I didn't even make tea. I just stared at the dining table where Alan used to fall asleep with the newspaper over his chest. I couldn't bring myself to feel anger yet. I was too stunned, too hollow. But somewhere beneath the stillness, something had started to shift. Not loud, not angry, just the quiet sense that this wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Jocelyn gave birth in early spring. The day was warm enough that the windows could stay open, and the robins were already nesting in the trees behind their house. Bryce called me in the morning. His voice was brighter than I had heard in months. He said everything went smoothly, said the baby had arrived healthy with a strong grip and a head full of dark hair. I brought a small bag of baby things I had kept over the years. A quilt I made back when Bryce was little. A wooden rattle Alan had carved. They had sat untouched in my closet for decades, but I had kept them for something like this. Jocelyn met me at the door and took the bag with a quick thanks. She didn't invite me to sit down, said the baby was napping. Still, I stood at the edge of the nursery, just close enough to see. The child was swaddled tightly, face turned toward the soft morning light. He was small, pink-cheeked and peaceful. Nothing strange, nothing out of place until his head shifted slightly and I saw his eyes. They were open, and they were grey. Not blue-grey, not hazel, grey. The same deep stone grey Alan had carried his whole life. I couldn't stop looking. My son's eyes were brown, mine were green. Jocelyn had green eyes too, more hazel in the sun. But those eyes in that crib, those were not from either of them. I had seen them for 43 years, across every dinner table and vacation photo. They were Alan's, exactly Alan's. The baby blinked, then curled his fingers and made a small movement with his hand. The gesture stopped me cold. He twisted his tiny fingers in the blanket. Not randomly, not as a reflex. It was deliberate, familiar. He rolled the blanket edge twice, then tucked it down, just like Alan used to do with his napkin at every meal. A strange little quirk I had teased him about for years. I didn't say a word. Jocelyn came around behind me with a bottle in hand and smiled. Told me she was still getting used to the schedule. She looked relaxed, comfortable, like a woman who had everything in order. She adjusted the baby's blanket casually, but I noticed the subtle way her body blocked me from seeing too much. She had started to manage perception. In the kitchen, Bryce made coffee and chatted about paint colors. He was already talking about redesigning the nursery. He said Jocelyn had a vision for the space. I nodded, drank from the mug he handed me and listened like I was supposed to. But my head was spinning. Everything about that child told a different story, a quieter one that lived in bone structure and habit. And something inside me, something old and instinctive, began to speak louder than logic. I had been a mother long enough to know when something wasn't lining up. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in bed holding a picture of Alan from the year we retired. He was holding a napkin in his right hand, twisting the corner in a little loop, just like the baby had done. His eyes were looking directly at the camera, and they looked exactly like the ones I had seen that morning. Not similar, the same. I didn't know what to do yet. I didn't even have the words for what I was beginning to suspect. But the weight of it pressed hard. Not just fear, not just betrayal, but the horrifying possibility that Alan had known what he was doing when he wrote that will. He hadn't been fooled. He had been part of it. The next clue came from a photo I wasn't supposed to find. I was in the attic, looking for an old lamp to donate. Alan had always kept our records and family keepsakes up there packed into carefully labelled boxes. It had been months since I touched anything of his, but something drew me to the plastic bin marked Gala Events 2016 to 2019. I opened it half thinking I'd find boring brochures and receipts. Instead, I found a stack of photographs printed in matte finish. Alan had always insisted on printing his favourites, said digital files were too easy to forget. I flipped through glossy images of him in black suits and navy ties, posing with donors and former colleagues. One photo made my hand stop. It was Alan, at a fundraising gala in Burlington. He had one hand on the back of a young woman in a champagne-coloured dress. She was turned slightly toward him, her face caught mid-laugh. Her hair was shorter than a lighter shade, but I knew that smile. I knew the way she tilted her chin. It was Jocelyn. The timestamp was 2.5 years before Bryce brought her home for dinner. I sat down on the floor, knees stiff against the attic boards. I looked at that photo until the edges blurred. They had known each other, not just in passing. Alan's body language told everything. The easy closeness, the hand too familiar at her waist, the relaxed shoulders. Jocelyn was smiling the way a woman smiles when she knows she's winning something no one else realizes is in play. It wasn't just a coincidence. I went through the rest of the photos. There were 3 more with Jocelyn, always on Alan's right side, sometimes holding a wine glass. Once her hand rested lightly on his forearm. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't someone Bryce introduced later. She had been there before. Long before. Later that evening, I sat across from Mrs. Folsom on her front porch. She was 83, sharper than most people I knew, and had watched everything on our street for decades. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I just asked casually if she remembered Jocelyn visiting before Bryce brought her around officially. She didn't hesitate. Said she remembered seeing Jocelyn step out of Alan's car on a Tuesday morning. Said it was a cold day because she had just salted her driveway. That was nearly 3 years ago. I thanked her. I didn't say anything more. At home, I pulled out my planner from the same year. Alan had told me he was away for a board retreat that week. I had spent the weekend alone reading in bed and thinking he was doing something honourable. Now I could see it differently. He had lied. Not just once, not about something small. He had been careful, strategic. He hadn't just been swept into something. He had allowed it, maybe even orchestrated it. The will, the baby Jocelyn's sudden presence, it all started to make a cold kind of sense. I wasn't ready to say it aloud, but I no longer believed she was just a manipulator and he was her victim. I was starting to wonder if they had chosen each other, and if Bryce had only ever been a cover. That night I closed the attic bin and slid it back into place. But I kept the photo. I tucked it into the back of my journal between pages I had left blank for a reason I didn't understand until now. There was no denying it anymore. The story I thought I had lived was only half the truth. The other half was still unfolding, and I was no longer willing to stand on the sidelines while it did. The next morning, I took the photo and drove 2 towns over to a small clinic just past the county line. They had a lab that handled private paternity tests. No questions, no judgment. I filled out the form under a false name. I listed myself as a concerned relative, which wasn't a lie. I handed over a sealed envelope containing a small lock of hair. A week earlier, I had found strands of the baby's hair caught in a blanket, left on the guest couch. Jocelyn had tossed it aside after a feeding, not thinking much of it. I folded it neatly, took it home, and slipped it into an envelope. I had not touched it again until that day. The nurse didn't blink when she took it. She handed me a receipt with a number and said the results would be ready in 5 to 7 business days. I nodded and walked out, heart pounding hard against my ribs as if I had just done something criminal. Back home, I opened a new notebook. Not my regular journal, not the one with family memories and old grocery lists mixed in. This one was clean, blank. I labeled the first page, Observations. I started writing everything I remembered. The baby's grey eyes, the way he twisted the blanket, Jocelyn's closeness to Alan in the photos, her early arrival in our family without introduction, Alan's retreat the week of that gala, the exact words in his will. I listed each item like puzzle pieces on a table, trying to see what shape they were forming. By the third page, a pattern had started to take shape. Jocelyn hadn't stumbled into our lives. She had been let in, welcomed, maybe even chosen. And the baby was not just a child. He was proof of something Alan had tried to secure before he died. A legacy, but not through Bryce, through someone else entirely. I started watching more carefully. At dinner the following Sunday, Bryce talked about baby names and college funds. Jocelyn barely reacted. Her smiles came late, like she was playing a part that no longer thrilled her. She excused herself often, checked her phone more than usual. She never once corrected Bryce when he referred to the baby as his mirror image. She just nodded and sipped her wine. I listened quietly, offering small comments here and there, while writing down mental notes to add to the notebook later. That evening, I waited until everyone was asleep. I went back into the living room and opened the bottom drawer of Bryce's old desk. He rarely used it anymore. Inside was a stack of folders, half buried under old cords and envelopes. Tucked behind them was a copy of the revised trust Alan had signed 6 months before he passed. It was clearer than the will. Jocelyn had been named interim guardian of the estate. Not Bryce, not both of them, just her. And it would remain that way until a male heir demonstrated recognizable Redmond traits. If none appeared, the estate would revert to a charitable foundation Alan had quietly set up, managed by an outside board. He had built an entire structure to bypass me. And if things went wrong with Jocelyn, to bypass Bryce too. I sat there in the dim light, staring at the document. I could feel the shape of my life shifting again, this time with sharper edges. Alan hadn't just betrayed me. He had architected a future without me in it. I closed the drawer and walked back upstairs. The next morning, I called the clinic to confirm my results were ready. They said yes. I told them I'd come by in person. I didn't want the truth in my mailbox. I wanted to hold it in my hands. I needed to feel its weight. Because by then, I already knew what it was. 3 days later, Jocelyn called to invite me to the launch event for the new Redmond Legacy Scholarship. It was being held at the Burlington Civic Hall with local press donors and Alan's old university contacts in attendance. She said it would mean a lot if I were there. She said Bryce would be giving a short speech. She even offered to send a car, which she never did. I said yes. I chose my outfit carefully that morning. A navy wool dress I hadn't worn in years, and the brooch Alan had given me on our 35th anniversary. I packed a small digital recorder in my purse and made sure it was fully charged. The building was already buzzing when I arrived. Jocelyn met me at the entrance with a radiant smile and 2 glasses of champagne. She handed me one like we were friends hosting together. Her eyes were glossy, her makeup impeccable. But when I looked closer, I noticed the tightness in her grip, the slight delay before she greeted me by name. She led me through the crowd, stopping often to shake hands, touch elbows, pose for photos. People called her by her first name, like they had known her for years. I stood beside her quietly, watching, memorizing. At the front of the room was a podium draped in a dark red cloth with Alan's portrait framed next to it. There were 3 rows of white chairs for the speakers. I was given one on the edge. Jocelyn sat in the center. Bryce's speech was short and nervous. He read from a card and stumbled over a few lines. He thanked Jocelyn for her leadership. He called the scholarship a living tribute to his father's values. Jocelyn took the stage next, and the room seemed to lean forward. She spoke clearly, with warmth. She thanked everyone for supporting Alan's vision. She used words like integrity, stewardship, and legacy. She said the Redmond name would continue to guide future generations. Her voice never shook. Her gaze never drifted. But she never once mentioned me. Not as Alan's wife, not as Bryce's mother, not as someone who had spent a lifetime beside the man they were all pretending to honor. I sat there with a steady expression, hands folded in my lap recorder, running silently inside my purse. After the speeches, a reporter from the local paper approached her for a quick interview. I drifted close enough to hear. Jocelyn spoke about the Redmond estate and how its values shaped the scholarship. She referred to the estate's transition plan as something Alan had carefully outlined for the future of his legacy. I recognized the phrase, word for word. It had come from the revised trust document, the one I had found in the desk drawer. She was reciting it as if it were her own. Later during the reception, she pulled me aside and said she appreciated my grace. She called me elegant, said I reminded her of Alan's steadiness. I smiled. I told her the event was impressive, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, that brief second when her expression dipped just enough for me to notice. Like a woman who knows she's being watched more closely than she expected. I stayed another 20 minutes, made polite conversation, then slipped away before dessert. In the car, I took the recorder from my purse and replayed her exact words to the reporter. It was all there. Enough to show she was claiming ownership of Alan's estate publicly before the trust had legally transferred. Enough to raise doubt. Enough to build something stronger than suspicion. I went home and began typing a transcript of everything she had said. I added it to the folder marked documentation. That night I didn't sleep. I wasn't nervous. I was preparing. The envelope from the clinic arrived on a grey Thursday. I waited until the house was completely quiet before opening it. I placed it on the kitchen table next to a cup of tea I hadn't touched, and stared at my name written in block letters across the top. They had printed the results on plain white paper. No drama, no bold fonts. I read every line carefully. The conclusion was clear. The probability of Bryce being the biological father was 0%. The likelihood of a paternal match with Alan was over 99%. It was not a suspicion anymore. It was fact. The baby in that house, the one being called Bryce Jr., was not my grandson. He was my late husband's son. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. I wasn't angry. That had come and gone weeks ago. What I felt now was something different. Cold, clean, like glass being wiped free of fog. Alan had betrayed me not just emotionally but genetically. He had seeded a future that would not carry my name. not my bloodline, not my truth. And he had built an entire legal structure to protect it, to protect Jocelyn. I walked to my study, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the folder marked documentation. I added the paternity report to the transcripts and photos. Then I slid the recorder in next to it. The folder was thicker now, heavier in my hands. I called Samin Carr the next morning. She didn't ask why I wanted a meeting. She gave me a time that afternoon. In her office, I placed the folder on her desk and sat down. I told her I needed her to go through everything, slowly, thoroughly. I said I was no longer asking out of curiosity. I was asking as Alan's legal widow and a potential challenger to the terms of the estate. Samin listened without interruption. She took notes. Her brows lifted once when she read the test results, but she didn't comment. When she finished, she placed her pen down and looked at me with something close to respect. She said the information was enough to request a formal review, that Alan's mental state during the drafting of the trust could be questioned, especially if evidence showed manipulation or concealment, that his use of antidepressants and the lack of disclosure to Bryce could work in our favor. She said it would not be quick, and it would not be quiet. I nodded. She asked if I wanted to pursue it publicly or privately. I said I wanted to do it correctly. That evening, I didn't tell Bryce. I didn't even call him. I needed time. Not just for strategy, but for my own heart. I walked through the garden Alan had planted years ago. The lavender was still blooming near the back gate. I watched the bees drift through it like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. The boy in Jocelyn's arms was not my grandchild. Bryce was living under a lie. And Alan, the man I had spent most of my life with, had chosen a legacy I had no place in. I stood in the fading light and thought about silence, about how long I had stayed quiet out of love, out of habit, out of not wanting to make things worse. But silence had become its own kind of betrayal. And now it was my turn to speak, but not with shouting, not with confrontation, with precision, with law, with truth printed in black ink. I went inside and wrote a letter, not to Bryce, not to Jocelyn, to the board overseeing Alan's foundation. I requested a meeting, attached the test results, labeled it confidential. It was time to break the shape Alan had built, not to destroy him, but to remind the world who had stood beside him long before the others arrived. 2 weeks after I sent the letter, I met with the board. They had arranged the meeting in a small conference room at the local courthouse annex, not the foundation's downtown office. That told me everything I needed to know. They didn't want visibility. They didn't want to seem like they were taking sides. What they wanted was neutrality, control. There were 5 members, all of whom had worked with Alan during his last few years. One was a retired professor. One was a banker. One had been a long-time partner in his community outreach projects. None of them looked surprised to see me. Samin came with me. She had prepared a full binder. Inside were the test results, the voice recording of Jocelyn's public comments at the scholarship event, the timeline of her relationship with Alan, the photos I had found in the attic. Samin presented everything calmly. She made no accusations, only laid out facts, dates, names, documents. I watched their eyes shift as she turned each page. When she was done, I spoke. I didn't make a speech. I didn't ask them to undo the will or rewrite history. I simply told them I had been Alan's wife for 43 years, that I had stood by him through cancer, through recovery, through long nights when he couldn't sleep, and short mornings when he didn't want to get out of bed. I told them I had been left out of the estate, not because I was unworthy, but because I had known too much, because I saw what he tried to hide. Then I stood up, handed over a sealed affidavit, and left the room without waiting for their response. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next day, I received a message from Samin. The board had agreed to pause all estate transitions until a formal investigation could be completed. They were requesting records from Alan's doctor and initiating a review of his prescriptions at the time the trust had been updated. They also wanted to speak with Bryce. I knew that last part would be the hardest. Bryce had lived in a story he believed was real. He had trusted Jocelyn. He had trusted his father. Now they were asking him to look under the floorboards of his own life and find something rotten beneath it. But it wasn't my job to protect him from that anymore. I was no longer holding up the house by myself. The following week, Samin and I met again with the Foundation's legal liaison. She confirmed the trust could be contested on the basis of undue influence and compromised mental clarity. If successful, the estate would be placed under provisional control and reallocated with oversight. I asked her what would happen to the child. She said the court might appoint a neutral guardian to represent the child's interests, given the nature of the conflict. Jocelyn, she said, could also be investigated if it was proven she misled or concealed information. I nodded, not because I felt victorious, but because I had expected it. None of this felt like winning. It felt like scraping away rot from old wood and realizing how far it had spread. At home, I sat with the quilt I had once meant to give the baby. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the cedar chest. That part of my life was closed now. I was not going to pretend to be something I wasn't. Not a grandmother to a child born of deception, not a widow left behind. I was a woman who saw the truth, named it, and acted. And I wasn't finished yet. The invitation came in a thick cream envelope, sealed with the same red wax crest Alan had once used on his personal stationery. Inside was a formal card, printed in serif font, inviting me to the unveiling of the Redmond Legacy exhibit at the local history museum. There would be a reception afterward, sponsored by the Foundation, with a keynote tribute delivered by Jocelyn. It was clear they still planned to present a version of the story where I did not exist. I arrived 15 minutes early. The museum hall had been transformed. Tall banners with Alan's portrait hung beside glass cases filled with artifacts from his business career, civic projects, and public service. There were photos of him cutting ribbons, shaking hands with mayors, standing beside Jocelyn in perfectly framed moments. I noticed they had chosen to crop Bryce out of several of the family images. And me, I was nowhere. I made my way to the far end of the room where the reception tables were being arranged. Samin met me there, holding a small folder. She whispered that the board had received the forensic review from Alan's prescribing doctor that morning. The report confirmed what we had suspected. His cognitive function had likely been compromised during the final months when the trust had been revised. We waited until the speeches began. Jocelyn stood on the stage beneath a soft spotlight. She wore a pale silk suit and held her notes loosely like she didn't need them. Her voice was steady as she described Alan's vision for the Redmond name. She thanked the board for preserving his values. She praised the estate plan for honoring generational continuity. She smiled when she mentioned the baby. Then she paused. For just a moment, something faltered. She glanced down, blinked longer than necessary, then raised her chin again. She finished her remarks and stepped away to polite applause. I waited until the room settled. Then I walked to the stage. Samin followed me up the side stairs. I stood behind the podium and thanked everyone for coming. I said I had just a few words to share. I kept my voice low, my tone measured. I didn't raise it once. I held up a small recorder. I pressed play. Alan's voice filled the hall. It was a message he had recorded the month before he died. Something he had dictated into a voice memo one Samin had found stored under a generic file name in his archived email. In it, he spoke slowly, haltingly. He mentioned confusion, regret. He said he had been pressured, that he wasn't sure what was right anymore, that he hoped someone, meaning me, would understand what he had done and why he could no longer undo it. The room went silent. When the recording ended, I read one sentence from the forensic report. Then I stepped down. Jocelyn stood frozen near the second row. Bryce had turned pale, gripping the back of a chair. A few donors whispered among themselves. I didn't stay for the reception. Outside, the air smelled like damp stone and cut grass. I walked to the edge of the parking lot, where the shadows were longer. I looked back only once. Through the museum window, I saw the banners swaying gently from the ceiling. The legacy had been rewritten, but not by Jocelyn. Not anymore. The next week unfolded slowly, like the air had shifted, but no one was ready to name it. Bryce called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice was quiet, unsteady. He didn't ask anything directly. He just said he needed some time away from the house. He mentioned staying with a friend up north for a few days. I said I understood. We didn't speak again for nearly a week. In that time, the board moved forward with the formal restructuring of the foundation. Samin kept me informed of every step. The trust was placed under temporary conservatorship, pending a full reallocation. Jocelyn was suspended from any managerial role until the legal review was completed. They assigned a third-party administrator to oversee all foundation transactions. The estate was no longer in her hands, but I felt no satisfaction in watching it slip away from her. What settled inside me instead was something quieter. Not vindication, not victory, just a strange, necessary stillness. I spent more time in the garden, pulled weeds, trimmed the edges of the rosemary beds Alan had once insisted on growing in perfect symmetry. The order he loved was still there, but the meaning of it had changed. Now I saw the way he had tried to hold the world in place, while something inside him unraveled. One afternoon I found a letter tucked into my mailbox without a stamp. It was from Jocelyn. She had written it by hand on heavy cream paper that matched the invitation from the museum. The handwriting was even deliberate. She didn't apologize. Not exactly. She said she had done what she thought was necessary for the child, that Alan had promised protection, and she had believed he meant it. That the inheritance was never about power for her, only security. At the bottom, she wrote that she would not fight the board's decision. She said she had arranged to move out of the Redmond house by the end of the month. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer that now held the test results, the photographs, and the transcript from Alan's recording. Not out of anger, not as evidence, just as a reminder of where the silence had led. Bryce returned 3 days later. He came by unannounced, parked in the same spot he had as a teenager when sneaking back after curfew. I saw him through the window and opened the door before he knocked. We sat in the kitchen. I poured coffee without asking. He didn't look at me at first, just stared at his hands. Then, without preamble, he said he knew. Said he had suspected something once, but had buried it. Said he didn't want to believe his father could do that, or that Jocelyn would lie for that long. He asked if I hated them. I told him no. I told him I didn't have space in my life for hate, only for clarity, for choosing what to carry and what to leave behind. He nodded, looked older than he had just weeks ago. Then he reached across the table and rested his hand lightly over mine. It was the first time we had touched in months. We didn't speak more than a few words after that. But when he left, I watched him go with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The truth had torn something open, but it had also let something new in. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something quieter, something closer to real understanding. And in that stillness, I started to imagine the shape of a life that didn't have to prove itself anymore. Only live truthfully, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. The day the board finalized the reallocation of the trust, I was in the library helping sort the annual donation inventory. I hadn't told many people what had been unfolding. Most of the town still believed the Redmond name stood for quiet dignity and quiet wealth. Let them. Some truths were too tangled to explain quickly. Samin called just before noon. Her voice was clear, steady. She told me the final structure had been approved. The trust would no longer be anchored in a single heir or family line. Instead, it would be restructured into a charitable endowment focused on literacy, food security, and access to housing for older women facing financial displacement. Women like me. Like many I had met quietly through the years, women whose names were never on plaques, but whose hands built homes, raised children, kept families together. I sat down on the library bench and listened as she read the new mission aloud. Alan's name would remain on the foundation for legal continuity, but the fund itself would be renamed in honor of those often written out of the narrative. The Redmond Resilience Fund, a phrase I had suggested in passing weeks ago, never expecting they would actually use it. That night, I lit a candle beside Alan's photograph. Not for him, but for the part of me that had tried for years to hold us together. I didn't cry. I just sat quietly and let the light burn down. I had stopped needing his approval. What I wanted now was peace, and I had built it piece by piece without asking permission. Bryce came by the next morning. He brought a box of old books from the house, said they didn't belong to Jocelyn, said they always felt more like mine. I took them and didn't argue. Inside was the copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn Alan had given me the first year we were married. The note inside had faded, but the curve of his writing still stirred something in me. Grief, maybe, or memory. Bryce didn't stay long, but before he left, he turned and said he was sorry for being blind, that he had wanted things to be simple, that he now understood why I couldn't pretend anymore. I told him life had never been simple. He nodded, and we didn't say more. I took the books upstairs and placed them back on the shelf like they had never left. Later, I stood at the window and watched the light stretch long across the lawn. The garden was quieter now, trimmed and clean. The chaos had receded. Not gone, but distant, like a storm that had passed through and left something altered in the soil. I no longer felt like a shadow in someone else's story. I had written a new ending, one where I wasn't erased, where I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard, where the truth lived not in confrontation, but in stillness, in clarity, in a woman returning to herself. A month later, I walked through the gates of the new community garden built behind the literacy center. The foundation had partnered with local groups to reclaim an unused lot near the river. The soil had been turned boxed beds, laid, and benches carved from reclaimed wood. On one of them, a plaque was fixed in brass, for those who kept giving even when no one remembered their names. I sat there for a while, letting the morning sun warm the side of my face. Around me, volunteers moved quietly, planting beans, tomatoes, marigolds. No one recognized me, and I didn't need them to. I had spent years giving quietly, then years being silenced quietly. Now I had chosen to exist without needing to explain myself. I had nothing left to prove, no name to chase, no legacy to protect that wasn't already inside me. The old house stood 3 blocks away, now empty. Jocelyn had moved out without ceremony. Bryce had decided not to return. He had taken a position in another city, something new, something quiet. We spoke on the phone now and then. There were no promises, just space, just possibility. Back home, I made tea and opened the window. The lavender I had replanted that spring had taken root again, stronger than before. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook, the last page still blank. I thought about filling it, but then I closed it instead. Some endings don't need a final sentence. They only need silence and peace, and the knowledge that nothing and no one could ever write me out again. If this story found something in you, maybe a silence you've carried, or a truth you've had to face, quietly know this: you are not alone. We tell these stories not just to remember, but to remind each other that dignity is not loud, but it is powerful. If you're still listening, thank you for sharing this space with me.